Here we are, the end of 2024.
I can't believe it.
How
I
did we
just
get
can't
here?
believe it. It's crazy. We made a
It is.
whole year of podcasting, Jason. This is nuts.
I know. Remember, I was never going to podcast. I
I
said
know.
never, and
You
here it
did say
is.
never.
I did.
That never works well for me. I'm just saying. But I guess it
I
doesn't work
know.
well for you either. So
No, not at all.
to kick us off, today we talk a lot about planning, and we're pretty good at planning, but we've seen some really bad attempts at planning. So I thought today, let's just talk about how to screw up 2025 because we don't even have to try too hard. We're going to be really good at this. But to get us kicked off, Jason, on the farm, let's talk about it. We're going to talk about today messing with data, not having data, all the things that can screw up a good plan. So kick us off. How does that work in farming? Talk to us about that.
Well, it's tax season, so half the year is tax season on the farm. So right now we're planning financially, right? And we have to
Yeah.
end one tax year before we start the next tax year. So there's a lot of meetings with the CPA saying exactly how do we want these numbers to end this year? And so there's a lot of finagling the numbers, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's what you do with taxes is you make the numbers look a certain way because you can take advantage of tax code, you can take
Mm-hmm.
advantage of loopholes and you can kind of make it up as you go. And I think that has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about today.
It certainly does. And in consulting for 12 years, I swear, I've tried forever to have a decent CPA that can give me tax advice to kind of know where we are. But I'm telling you, there's certain years I have to pay a lot. One year I got such a big return, I had to go down to the federal tax building because they wouldn't send me the check because it was too
Mhm.
big to send it back. I mean,
Yep.
how does that happen? And but you're right, it's really hard when you're not a full-time just employee where you know
Yep.
the numbers week in, week out, that data gets all over the place. And so we're going to talk about that today. So we're going to talk about strategic plans and some of just the best of the best we've seen this last year of what just was not good. So kick us off. Talk to us about planning. What's the reason we should plan? Let's start with the positive and then let's just dive right into the what doesn't work.
Well, it's a new year, right? We should be planning. We should be thinking about our data. I've been doing a lot of sustainability planning lately with
Mhm.
organizations. And so we should be thinking about how are we going to fulfill our mission?
That's
What are
right.
we going to put in place, our goals, our strategies to grow or to hone in, to be more
Yeah.
focused? And so usually we would start the year off when we do a podcast, Renee, and we talk about all the exciting things we can do.
Hmm.
I'm just not in that place right now because I'm just kind of
Nope.
like, let's just go straight to the what we see happen in a lot. And we don't get called into healthy organizations. Let's just remind
No,
ourselves of
no.
that, right? We get called in because somebody's like, you know what? We don't know what we're doing. And then we're like, well, let's help you to kind of sort this out. And so here we are. I think the best thing we can do to talk about today is what can you do to make sure that you're not going to be successful in 2025?
Oh, yeah. Let's just talk straight up. So I've been in government now for a past year, and I'm not a typical government employee, right? I've been an entrepreneur for a very long time. So for me in government, it's kind of funny because things are very, very different. And they're trying very hard to reset and restructure how you do strategic planning, what metrics we're going to do, all of this stuff. And so it's a very, comes from a very good place of trying to streamline and organize. But I tell you what, if I have to do one more report, I'm just going to lose it. Because, like, I don't even know who's the audience, and I don't think anybody reads this stuff. And so we were just working on a project and found out after we did the report that one wasn't really needed because they were going to give us a break. Did they tell us that? Oh, no. And then we have this list we're trying to keep up. We're trying to start making like a cadence in the office of when things are due. We've never had that. And so it's pretty chaotic, just like the places we like to work. And so we're trying to make, like kind of a timeline and a flow sheet. So my assistant's putting down all the reports we have to do in the office and when they're due. We reached out to somebody who's supposed to be the expert in government on these things, and they don't have a master list. There's no master list of what reports we actually should have to do. How in the world can an office who's even trying to hit metrics and turn things in on time if you don't even know what to do? So I'm saying right there, too many reports, no schedule, no expectations, and nobody's reading it. I think that's a way to set up 2025 to fail. What do you think?
I think you're onto something there. And I think that's how do we use the data and the reports we have, and how do we make them useful so that they can actually be a tool that direct what we do? And I think we have the two extremes, right? Either we're tracking the wrong data or we
That's
have
right.
no data at all.
That's right.
And 90% of the time, I'm like, well, where does this data come from? And no one can answer the question. We have to start with, are we collecting the right data? Or are we not tracking data at all? Or are we so far going in a different direction, we're not even tracking what we think we're tracking?
Oh, I know. So I have some legislative stuff I needed done this year, and we couldn't get the specific data we needed because they don't track it specifically
Hmm.
enough to get what I actually need to be able to move forward. So stuff's going to get put on hold, which makes logical sense, right? And you can't really move forward on something if you don't know how much something costs, or you shouldn't. I get
Right.
that, but I don't think there's a way to get the specific information that I need. I don't think it exists because they're tracking the wrong thing. So, again, we had a strategic plan. These items were going to move forward in the legislative session coming up. It starts here in a couple weeks. This was going to be an agenda item, and now it can't because they're not even tracking the right thing. So I don't know if we can go in and try to fix that so they could track the right thing so that I have a shot for next year, or if it's just hopeless because we're never going to know the numbers. I don't know. That part drives me crazy. At the same time, to your point, they're tracking all this other stuff that I don't need for anything. And
Hmm.
we got all the details of all this other stuff that I'm like, what do we need that for when we need to know this specific information that they're like, well, we don't track to that level of detail to be able to determine. I live it every
Hmm.
day. Government's really good at this. Very, very good at this, Jason.
Well, and I think that's the conversations we have a lot is, it's how do we map our data and how do we not get stuck in data overwhelm? And so I'm,
Overwhelm.
I'm coining
Mm,
that term today,
I like it.
because so oftentimes we get in that data overwhelm, we just get stuck. We're like, well, we don't have the right level of detail, or it's just not quite the right metric. Well, if it's measuring the gist of what we want, sometimes that's better than not measuring anything at all, or just getting stuck and saying we have to wait until we build something new, because in the interim, then we don't even know if it's worthwhile, the build that we're trying to get
Mm-mm.
to. And it's hard with data because sometimes we kind of have to cut a corner here and there to at least get a sense of, are we going in the right direction or not?
Agreed.
And I think that's really a challenge. It's a challenge, especially in government, but it's
Mm,
also a challenge with small organizations that are overwhelmed. They don't know how to manage their data systems. They may not have the access levels that they need. They may be relying on third parties for a lot of that stuff. And so it's really
yeah,
looking at, how do we make sure we're narrowly focusing in? We sometimes we can't measure everything. So
that's right.
what are the five things we need to operationalize and run our business? And that's
Yeah,
all we're going to measure. Sometimes less is more. If we find out down the road we're measuring the wrong stuff, then you pivot and we start to measure the right thing. But
yeah,
it's so oftentimes we get these gigantic data reports from an organization. I'm like, what does this say? They're like, I don't know. That's what we had created to measure all of this stuff. But I'm like, well, if no one here can tell me what it means, I'm not sure what we're doing.
that's right. I just mentioned earlier that in government, they're trying to reorganize all of this. And so there was a list of key performance indicators, or I think they were mostly lagging indicators, but there was a list of things that they measured for years and years and years. And the specific department I'm in really has no ownership of any of that.
Hmm.
It was numbers that, because we are partnered with corrections, a lot of the work is, well, like for example, how many cases will we do? Well, however many they send us. How
Right,
many victims would you register? Well, however many there are. And so, which that doesn't look good, right? When you're trying to measure
right.
data, you don't want just a made up number. But that was the truth. It was like we don't control a lot of that stuff, but
Hmm.
forever legacy, they've done these. So one of the best parts about this year when we did our strategic plan is they let me delete. So to your point, we deleted many, 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 many numbers that we honestly didn't have any
Right.
control over. I finally found somebody. What ended up happening, somebody retired and a new person came on board. Not kidding, but a
Right.
new person understood my plight because I could say, "Look, I can't control these numbers." I said, "You're
Hmm.
like measuring or grading us on something that we literally can't control." And in and we're a small office in a lot of ways like that because our it's third party data. We don't get to collect our own,
Hmm.
and so we're kind of at the whim of the other group. And we're like, these are not our real numbers, right? These are not things.
Right.
So they actually listened and let me change stuff that made things that we could impact. So I'm hoping to that point this year, in this case, we're going to be able to track things that we can actually have
Mhm.
something to do with. Because the goal, again, if we go back to what it's supposed to be, it's supposed to have that information then, and they can track it all the way down to what employees are supposed to be doing, and in
Right.
their job descriptions and in their performance, that they're making progress toward those goals. But if you have completely obsolete information that nobody can control, there's no way to hold people accountable to things that they're smart enough to know. We don't control that. So it's
Right.
like, well, what difference does it make what I do in my job? Because I have no control over this, whatever it is. And so we had to really, really restructure a lot of that. And but think of how many organizations are out there, to your point, tracking the wrong thing, and then they can't figure out how to hold people accountable. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And
Oh,
that's a big way to fail.
let's let's talk about that. You made a perfect segue into accountability, right? What do we do with the data once we have the data? I've been looking at working with some organizations around sustainability, looking at the system transformations we're undergoing. And so sustainability is a big conversation right now, of how are we going to continue to do the work that we
Mhm.
do with contract shifting, with payers shifting, with all of the changes happening. And I've got a threefold thing here for you, Renee. I'm going to
I
start
can't
with
wait.
a conversation I had at a conference I was just at. A gentleman who his company is going in and helping organizations understand their contracts. And he said to me, do you know what percentage of organizations I go to, they've actually read the contracts that they have with managed care
Probably very,
organizations
very small.
and insurers? He said about 90% have never read the contract and they
Wow.
don't know what it says.
Wow.
And so we had this fascinating conversation of if we don't even understand what we're supposed to be delivering, how can we measure it and how can we use data to
Well,
effectively operate our businesses?
in our business, as you know, we have a contract.
Yep.
And oftentimes that is the contract that we use with almost any vendor we work with
Yep.
because we have one that has been looked at by attorneys. We know what
Mhm.
it does, and I'd rather use mine so I know what
Right.
I'm held accountable to. But otherwise, I mean, it happens all the time where when you're going to do work for somebody else and they say, "Well, do you have a contract we can use?" And
Yes.
that's how ours came into be years and years
Yep.
ago. I've had that
Yep.
contract, and I can tweak it for what the situation,
Yep.
but that's how that came into be, to your point. So I know what our contract says,
Right.
but to that point, nobody does. And
And I know what our deliverables are for every project we do because I go back to that contract that everyone agreed to and I'm like, well, this is what we're going to deliver because this
that's
is
right.
what you signed and this is what we
And it's very
agreed to.
specific. We have it broken
Right.
down into appendices on scopes of work.
Yep.
So you know, which is really important for people listening. It's like if you're a consultant or you're a person working and you don't have that defined, scope creep, if you've never heard the term, happens all the time where somebody you're working for is like, well, you could just add this on and you don't get paid for it. Just add this on or a little more time or one more meeting or one more
Mhm.
thing. And if you don't have it defined, you're the next thing you know, you're working for pennies because all you've done is more and more and more
Right.
and more work, and there's nothing to define, hey, that's outside the scope of what I do.
Right.
People in employment do that all the time too. They have, it's
Mhm.
called a PDQ, which I don't even know if I know the acronym because somebody told it to me the other day, but whatever that acronym is in government, it's basically your job description. So it'd be like a JD in most places, but it's in government, it's a PDQ, I think. So it's about your position and like your definition of what you do, maybe qualifications. Anyway, whatever that is.
It doesn't
So
mean pretty darn quick, does it?
no, it doesn't. So that's what I'm saying. There's a term, another acronym that somebody just puts
Acronyms,
out there.
acronyms. We love
But
it. Yep.
generally, it's what you're hired as a contract to do in your job. And the person I was talking to said that somebody else was arguing with them that it was their job. And she's like, she could bust out her job description, if you will, and
Right.
just say, no, it's not. That's my job.
Right.
Step out, right? It's been in
Right.
my job since the day I took this job. You're not taking that away from me. You're not changing it. That's my job, not your job. And so it can be very helpful in that. But
Right.
if people don't have that, it's the contract, like you're saying, but it's also all the way down to
Yep.
what are people supposed to be doing?
Right. And that could exactly connects to managing data, setting strategy, and
Yes.
setting goals and measuring. And so that connection, that common thread doesn't always occur. And so sometimes it takes a third party like us coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, can you connect these dots for me? Because I'm struggling to understand, which comes to my second point, right? Is I asked for I'm working on a sustainability plan with an organization and they said, well, you know what? We did one. We did one just a little while ago. And I said, that's great. When did you do it? Well, it's been at least 3 years now. Okay. And they're like, oh, and it was a 3 year sustainability plan. Fantastic. I go, can we see that? And then I wait. I don't know where I put that. And so the person's on their laptop, and I'm like, well, that's okay. You can get it to me later. Right? Let's continue our meeting here. And I'm like, well, what did it say? Well, the sustainability plan was the goal was to get us out of a deficit. I'm like, okay, how are you doing? Well, we've been running a deficit for the last 10 years. So when we think about data and tracking and
Mm-mm.
pivoting and making changes, what,
Mhm.
what would we say to someone who told us that their goal was to get to a place, but for 10 years, they haven't been able to move the needle? And when we talk sustainability, that's like keeping your doors open of the business that you're doing, right?
Yeah,
So that's a non-negotiable in my book, right?
I don't know that I could have been in that meeting. I don't know if my face could have handled that one because I'd be like, what are you, I just would say basic, like, what are you doing? Like,
Well,
what
yeah.
are you doing? It's like you made a plan, followed none of it. And then
Right.
there were 7 years before that you weren't doing anything either. So what was the point of that? What was the
Well, to
point
be
of that?
fair, it's not that some things didn't happen, but not enough to move the needle, right? And I think this is the other barrier we fall
Wow.
into, right? That sometimes we lull ourselves into believing what we're doing is enough and we're just victims, right? And we've
Yeah.
all been to that place where folks are like, well,
Yeah.
we've done all we can do. We're done. Well, you're not done because you haven't gotten to the place where you have to be. And I think that's the we fall into that with nonprofits. We fall into that trap of thinking, well, we have no control over it. We have no control over our payers. We have no control over who we can serve.
Yeah.
Well, no, you have a lot of control. And it's
Yeah.
unacceptable, whether you're for profit or nonprofit, to not figure out how to be financially viable.
Yeah.
It's that's what a business is. And so, we really push back a lot. I did a lot of work to control my facial expressions, Renee,
I
because I was
imagine
really
so.
trying to be supportive and
Well,
engaging,
the
right?
other the other thing that could have happened is maybe the debt was substantial and you tried to do it all in 3 years, which is
Right.
another key failure point for planning. People don't think it's very exciting to lose a pound a month or,
Hmm.
whatever. They want to lose 25 pounds by,
Hmm.
you know, whatever,
Right.
the next holiday, which in this case may be spring break or something, right?
Hmm.
Well, it often fails because it's too big, too much, too fast,
Right.
right? And if you did the slow and steady sustainability, and
Hmm.
then like in debt, whether you like Ramsey or don't like him, Dave Ramsey,
Hmm.
he's got that
Yeah.
snowball debt plan, whether you like
Yeah.
him or not. But the
Yeah.
concept works, right? It's pay off something small,
Absolutely.
roll that amount of money into the next debt so that debt becomes big. You pay a bigger payment, and so that debt gets absorbed, and then you take the whole chunk into the next debt. And so, but it's a small snowball effect so that the snowball gets bigger. That is sustainable and practical.
Right.
So probably what happened in that case, not knowing anything because I wasn't there, not part of the situation, but maybe the debt was too much and too big, and so we just made this plan that was, we're going to cut out this whole thing in 3 years. And so it was so overwhelming that, at that point, then do you even try? Because you've made yourself goals that you fail from the start because your brain is
Right.
like, yeah, that's not realistic. So I
But
just am
let's go
going to do
back. But
nothing.
there was 7 years before that
Oh, yeah, I
that
don't
this
know
was
about that part.
continuing to happen, right? And so this is where accountability comes in, right?
Yeah,
So we go
hot
back
mess.
to where was the board of directors? Where
Well,
was the
yeah.
leadership team?
Who approved the plan?
Right? Who's approving a budget every year that isn't feasible, that doesn't even show you can break even? Who sets the goals and metrics for whatever it is they're producing that says, well, we're only going to charge 32 cents even though it costs us 50 cents to produce it, right? If we're in a factory producing widgets
Eh,
and it costs us 50 cents to produce the widget and we're going to sell it for 32 cents, what sense is that? Now, I will say this does happen in farming, right? I produce a bushel of corn and I may lose money on that bushel of corn some years, right? But I can't count on there always being a government program to bail me out. The same thing
No.
happens in the nonprofit sector, and especially behavioral health and healthcare, is that agencies become accustomed to overextending themselves because there will be a bailout. And I think that that's a dangerous precedent to set when we start to build our businesses around expecting a bailout, because that's not feasible long term.
In the legislature and in the work that I've ever done, we consider that one-time money for ongoing
Right.
expenses. And that can
Right.
become cliche and annoy the heck out of people, but it's really important. And so like think through COVID, a lot of ARPA dollars
Right.
came into our state that could be used and plugged a bunch of holes. But if you
Right.
plugged a hole that was a systemic hole like payroll, and you didn't come up with dollars to replace it, when the ARPA dollars go away, you can't make payroll. That's one
Yep.
example. I think too, for our listeners and people that are in Iowa, the provider, we're not naming any names, but they're in our state. So you can see reasons potentially for the redesign of regions into ASO
Mhm.
models, where there's going to be an administrative service organization who actually looks at data to drive a system. Because
Mhm.
a provider like that should have been held accountable not
That's
just
right.
by their own board, but by the people who were hiring them to do
Right.
the work. I mean, there's levels of what should have been accountability. It's an accountability failure. It's a leadership failure
Right.
across a lot of different pieces
And
because
the
it's one thing
system
that
fed
the
it. The system and the I
terrible.
mean, from this DHHS on down, it fed the system to operate this way,
Yeah, it's
and just
terrible.
encouraged bad behavior on every level. And so when organizations, as they grow, they don't know any different. And so you
Yeah.
have young leadership who's like, well, this is how it's always been. We,
Right. It's kind of, they sometimes become too big to fail, or like they're
yep,
the only provider in this area, so
yep,
they'll never shut us down.
right,
And that's a bad spot to be in because,
absolutely.
especially if in this day and age, outside resources, outside providers can come in. And I know throughout redesign the past decade,
Hmm.
different times, outside folks from other states have had to come in and start things up and wiped out some of our
Yep.
local or providers
And
because local
mhm.
providers couldn't do this. And
And
it's just not good. But that's
yep,
a sure way to fail, a sure way to fail.
right. And that's not necessarily good. Bigger isn't always better, right? I'm not a big Walmart fan in small town Iowa. But, I think that some of the systems that we are talking about, then that's what's incentivized because volume then drives cost benefit sometimes. So,
Yeah.
I think as we think about strategic planning, as we think about all of the pitfalls, I think a lot of these things we really have to take into account and think about how are we going to do this differently this year because we have to do it differently this year. We can't keep doing the same things we've done in the past and expect a different result.
Right. And on the idea of reports, like that we'll use your example there of the 3-year plan. If you don't go back and look at it 6 months, a year, and actually measure your data and your progress, what was the point? It's like,
Right.
that whole idea of not doing an annual report, well, because for whatever reason, that's the whole point. If you're actually trying to use metrics, you got to go back and measure yourself and say, are we
Mhm.
doing this? We have metrics in our office that we look at, and there's one or two that we can control. One that's important, but it's not 100% on us, but we still
Mhm.
track it. But I track it on a regular basis, and it's posted on my
Yep.
dry erase board, and I put it monthly, and then I flip it to quarters, and then I'm going to flip it annually here in a minute because we're going to hit into the end of the calendar year. And so, but we track it because I have priorities of what we're looking at, and it's always up on my wall reminding me that, hey, this is where we're going. And then every week we send out, there's an update that comes out from corrections, but I say, where the population is trending, but then where our part came in and, hey, we've dropped, we need to think about this, or hey, we're doing a good job, we're on track.
Mhm.
But, it's like a all the time situation because
Yep.
otherwise months and months get away from you quick. And then you're like, hey, I haven't looked at that plan in 3 years. And oh my
Yep.
gosh, now we've been in debt for 10.
It
That
has to
happens.
be visible. It has
Has
to
to
be
be.
visible and it has to be reminded of you. I'm not necessarily good at circling back at things, but you know that we have a meeting every month and Molly is tasked with Jason, we're going to look at our KPIs. We're going to go over where we've been, right? And so
Mhm.
I make sure I have that accountability built in to what we do here. I don't necessarily love that meeting, and it got scheduled for an extra half hour next month, for the end of the year. And I'm like, yes, I'll be there.
Hey, yay.
But it's important to do, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily our strength area. But if it's not our strength area, we're going to find people around us, and we're going to surround
That's right.
ourselves with people that it
Yeah.
is, and they're going to hold us accountable to do that. I'm a big advocate that there's certain things I'm not great at, but guess what? I have someone who's going to put that in front of me, and we're going to keep those things in focus, and that's
That's
what
why we
every
love
business should
Molly.
do. That is
If
why we love
anybody needs
Molly. So,
Molly's an integrator and she's an awesome human being and she keeps our trains on the tracks because Jason and I brain are on the vision side of life and we are on to the
yep.
next project and sometimes we're like, oh yeah, we should measure that. And then if we don't get held accountable to it. But I also want to just bring up an idea. I know we talked about this earlier in the year, but there was one of the things you were measuring, and I don't remember which one specifically, but it just wasn't happening, just wasn't working. And at one of your
Right.
quarterly reviews, you were like, we
Right.
weren't tracking it right, or we weren't
Mhm.
doing it right, or whatever. So you tweaked it, changed it, or deleted
Yep.
it, which is a big
Yep.
part of goal setting, right? It's like
Absolutely.
if you get into a plan and you're like, we just are not making progress on this debt reduction or whatever it
Hmm.
is, you got to tweak it, change it, or delete it. You can't just let
Yep.
it continue and act like you're making progress. That does
Right.
not work. And that's okay because goals don't always work in certain seasons, right? This
Mhm.
last year, you've traveled more than you have in a lot of years,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Right.
a lot of conferences. So you have to take in mind that you can't do some of the other things you might have
Right.
already done all the time because you were
Right.
different season. And so
Right.
next season, who knows? Maybe you travel less, and so you want to
Hmm.
add more other things. And that's just part of life. That's why it's so important to have a regular rhythm that you look at stuff
Right.
because goals that you have sometimes you have to tweak them and it doesn't may not work for that particular season. And so for my and this is going to roll right into the recovering politician self-care policy, but this is the time I set my own personal goals. I have some goals at work that I need to hit and those are always on my mind and in the forefront, but I set personal things that I want to work on. So I've been working on kind of brainstorming ideas, trying to think, okay, what does that look like? And I've had a hard year. I was sick for a very long time in 2024, and I need to reset some health things. Well, I can't have the same goals I had before because before I wasn't sick. So now I got to tweak some of that, right? I've got to think about, okay, what can I do to get stronger, get my lungs healthier so I don't get sick more, trying to avoid additional illness. So it's like that's a different kind of look. So this is the time. It's like a fresh start, new perspective. What needs to change? And it needs to be something exciting. Because if it's a boring goal, I don't do it. So I know for myself, I just if it's boring, I'm not doing it. And so sometimes that's an extra, maybe there's an activity I want to some hike I want to do. So I want to build up to the hike or a bike ride distance I want to do at a particular something this summer. And if I have a goal like that, that's like, oh, I want to keep working toward it. So I'm going to try to think of what those things are. And maybe we'll talk about more of those next week on the podcast of kind of like kicking off the new year and what we're going to think about. But Jason, this time of year for you at the end of the new year, or as we're heading into a new year, what are you thinking about? And I know it's not just the farm for you. So what else are you guys thinking about this year? Because you got your kids are grown and moving on. So what does this year look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at bigger changes, life moves, being in different places, maybe, looking at more seriously, moving to a different community. I mean, so I think, as you think about those are also stressful events, or they can be. So,
Mhm.
it's just setting your priorities, setting your goals, aligning your financial goals with your personal goals, and all of those things. I think that's a healthy and important thing to do at all times, and then review those things. So yeah, I'm thinking a lot about goals, both the positive and kind of the stressful ones, but figuring out how do you move forward, right? And that's what we all need to do during this time as we set goals. It's really about how are we moving ourselves forward personally, professionally, and within our relationships, financially, going back to
Mhm.
what we talk about all the time, right? Those
Mhm.
8 domains of wellness, right?
That's
We
right.
always end up back of you got to take care of your whole self. And so this is
That's right.
just part of wellness. And so, it all comes full circle in the work that
Well,
we do.
if you sell your house, then you have to clean out that basement. Your wife will be
I
very
don't.
excited.
That's a goal. I'm gonna have to just task Molly with checking in with me every week,
I
maybe,
just
as to how
I
I'm
just had a
working through
conversation with
that.
a friend. She says, everybody in the world should have to move every 10 years. So you get rid of
True.
some of this crap. And I was like,
That's
that is
true.
not the worst that is not the worst decision.
Not a bad
Because it's like
idea. It's
she's
true.
got a home and a parent's estate, the whole drill.
Yep.
I've been through it. And then you end up
Yep.
with extra and stuff. And so
Yep.
it's hard just to plan all that. Well, everybody, today we just went with how are you going to bomb 2025? And boy, have we seen a lot of people do some really bad things. Hopefully, you learned some good things and some good tips along the way. But the ways not to do it, track no data at all, or track the completely wrong data, or never look at the data ever again once you've done it, or require people to write a bunch of reports that nobody reads. Those are four things that'll make for sure that you're a big loser in 2025. See you, everybody. See you next time.